Unlike other Mediterranean places inhabited during the Neolithic, Malta was abandoned twice, and no one is quite sure why. These were not short periods either. Here's an overview of the most recent dating of the prehistoric phases of Malta, which are based on the Phases project that took place between 2013 and 2018. They took new samples for radiocarbon and optically stimulated luminescence dating, and then used Bayesian analysis to refine the timeline that had been determined many years before. The first period of abandonment followed the early Neolithic, which had been characterized by small farming communities who settled on the islands around 6000 BCE and remained for 1,200 years. This period of abandonment is referred to as the fifth millennium hiatus. The islands were then resettled around 1,000 years later, so that's a pretty big gap in the archaeological record. It was during this next period of habitation when megaliths were erected all over the island, although this didn't happen straight away, so there's a bit of a mystery there, but more on that later. The megalith builders stayed for around 1,600 years before disappearing in 2,200 BCE. The islands were empty for approximately 200 years before a Bronze Age culture appeared. The earliest inhabitants of Malta were farmers who lived in simple oval huts made of mud brick and stone. Pottery unearthed during excavations show a progression in styles over time. It's thought these farmers came from southeast Sicily because of the similarity between the first phase of their pottery, called Ardalum, and that of the Stentinello culture. Towards the end of the early Neolithic, they started making anthropomorphic figurines. This, along with other evidence, points to rudimentary ritual practices. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because the early Neolithic farmers abandoned their villages and left the islands empty for a millennium. There isn't a lot of evidence from the domestic sites of the early Neolithic. There also isn't a lot of evidence of domestic structures during the later temple period. But strangely, there are sites with evidence of all three. In my last video, I discussed Scorba, which yielded early Neolithic pottery, animal bones, and the remains of hut structures, including one that's thought to have been a shrine. After 1,000 years of abandonment, the site was then resettled in the temple period with the building of more domestic huts, before these were replaced with megalithic architecture. The Santa Verna temple in Gozo is another interesting site due to multiple periods of occupation. It's close to the Gigantea temples and the Shara stone circle and appears to have been built over the top of an early Neolithic village. Archaeologists have found pottery sherds from both the Ardalum and Scorba phases, as well as the remains of two early Neolithic Torba floors, which must have belonged to buildings. Another important site that was purely a domestic settlement in the early Neolithic, as well as the later temple period, is Tachola in Gozo. It's undergone several excavations in the past, with the most detailed one being carried out by the Phases project in 2014. The majority of the evidence points to activity there during the latter half of the early Neolithic, followed by a period of abandonment and then resettlement. It sits a few hundred meters northeast of the Tatmosina temple remains. A domestic building known as the Ein Selim road structure in Gozo was found to date to the temple period. Once again, there are a few unexcavated megalithic structures in the area. As mentioned in previous videos, the Ardalum phase is named after the cave where pottery of this earliest period of settlement was found. It seems these earliest inhabitants lived in both caves and simple dwellings. After the long period of abandonment, in the Zebush phase, the new settlers produced pottery similar to the Sancono Pianonotaro culture from Sicily. So there's a possibility they came from there, but nothing is certain. They dug rock-cut tombs and created anthropomorphic stone stela, which are very different to the figurines of the early Neolithic. The Zebush phase is named after the village where rock-cut tombs from the period were first found. This phase marks the start of the temple period, even though these monuments didn't actually appear for another few hundred years. And there are reasons for this convention. Firstly, there appears to be cultural continuity between this phase and later ones. The islands were inhabited throughout. Secondly, the pottery from the megalithic era seems to have evolved from that of the Zabush phase. Thirdly, rock-cut tombs continue to be a feature of the megalithic culture, albeit in much more sophisticated forms, such as the Hal Saflieni hypogeum and the Shara stone circle. However, the megalithic architecture, statues and carvings that were introduced during the subsequent phase known as Gigantea were indigenous and notably different from that which went before. This is a mystery, especially considering the sophistication that defined the temple people. The Zabush phase has no evidence of cruder megalithic forms which then developed over hundreds of years. In fact, the megalith builders' culture seems to have just appeared in a rather advanced form. So it seems the temple people continued the preceding cultural phase, as well as introducing new and innovative architectural and artistic techniques. The strongest possibility is that they acquired this knowledge outside of Malta, but nowhere else has anything similar. Megalithic buildings and structures are common at the same time period, earlier and later, but nothing matches the temples in terms of form and function. Just remember that while the temples were centers of ritual activity in Malta, contemporary cultures in Sicily and southern Italy were not building megaliths. The contemporary culture in Sardinia mostly concentrated on funerary monuments. Between the Tarshin phase and the earliest Bronze Age culture, the islands were empty again for several hundred years. In spite of their efforts to build, maintain, and remodel enormous megalithic structures, the temple people simply abandoned the islands. It's not known exactly why they left, although there are suggestions, and it's not known where they went. Nothing similar to the temples sprung up elsewhere in later years. The Phraxis project excavations included analysis of paleo soils and botanical samples so that more could be discovered about the environment in Neolithic Malta. The evidence points to the early Neolithic farmers and the temple people as having chosen sites which were fertile and often close to water sources. There are signs that towards the end of the temple period, environmental degradation took place in terms of climate, rainfall, and landscape. This may explain the abandonment of the islands. I guess it would also explain why the temple people chose to resettle sites that had been abandoned 1,000 years previously. If they had been located on fertile ground and close to water sources, it makes sense. Although I find it strange that they chose the exact same spots. But where did they go? I do see similarities between the megalithic buildings of the Taliotic culture that flourished in Minorca and Majorca during the Bronze Age and the Maltese temples, but that culture appeared more than half a millennium after Malta was abandoned. Perhaps they moved to another island and intermixed with the culture there, or maybe they tried to introduce their ideas, rituals, and buildings elsewhere, but couldn't get support from the local population. There are various possibilities, but no one knows for sure. The central Mediterranean in the Neolithic was connected in certain ways. This we know from pottery and tools that were imported from other areas. But it was also heterogeneous in terms of its cultures and the distribution of megalithic architecture specifically. The mystery remains, but my journey to solving it has only just begun. Let's keep exploring. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter for more content, and take a look at my website.